I'm going to share my son and several other young people's catastrophic experiences with today's neurotoxic plant. And I hope everybody will take time to read Brandt's story. It's extremely well presented. A little taller. My son, Shane Ryan Robinson, was already deceased when weed was legalized for recreational use in Colorado later in 2012. At that time, Governor Hickenlooper called his state's marijuana law one of the great social experiments of the century. Tragically, I strongly believe my son and all the children of our Mom Strong network are really the guinea pigs in this so-called experiment. My son started using pot at age 19, unbeknownst to my family, as he was living away from home. And he was dead by suicide at age 25, from the consequences of unknowingly playing Russian roulette in this culture of pot and losing. California voted to legalize medical marijuana back in 1996 when my son was just 10. Even though my husband and I have never used an illicit drug in our lives, our son grew up in an environment that legitimized it. Wherever I go, the common sentiment among the youth culture is, it's just pot. Kids today don't even associate marijuana as a drug. Our family didn't know then what we now know. The well-known foremost schizophrenic researcher, Sir Professor Robin Murray of the UK, was quoted in an interview earlier this year by the Dana Foundation. Quote, "Cannabis is generally accepted as a cause of schizophrenia, though less in North America, where this topic has received little attention. The use of marijuana in both Australian and European countries has actually dropped sharply because of the greater knowledge of the risks to mental health." Professor Murray stated, quote, "It's quite well substantiated by vast scientific studies. Heavy users of high-potency pot push up their risk of psychosis, and if they continue to use, it can develop into an illness that looks like schizophrenia." Our son was smart, popular, a gregarious guy with a go-getter type personality. He had an extremely strong work ethic. Shane earned his certified residential electrician license within 2 years post-high school and was a rising star in the small company, earning $5,000 cash bonuses at Christmas. 2009 held so much potential for my family. My husband and I would celebrate our 30th wedding anniversary. Our youngest son was headed out of state to a prestigious aeronautical college, and our oldest son, Shane, would get engaged to his longtime girlfriend, where a beautiful wedding was held on the campus of Cal Lutheran University, August 8th, 2009. Everything my son did was with gusto, and even with a severe knee injury from a boating accident, he was determined to proceed with their wedding. Shane was able to walk down the aisle without crutches, but he was still in physical rehab at this time. It would be much later that I learned my son's use of recreational pot increased substantially during this period, as Shane stopped taking the prescription pain pills he was prescribed because of severe stomach problems it caused him. 2 months after this magical wedding, a perfect storm of stressors occurred, and Shane's apparent use of recreational pot triggered a mind-altering psychosis at age 23. My knowledge of all this started literally the night that my husband and I found Shane after his bride called 911 on his overnight bizarre and escalating peculiar behavior. Shane agreed to get into our car, but it was the most terrifying moment for my husband and me. We were witnessing our own son's mind breaking down. Shane got into our car, though he attempted to jump out of our car on the moving 101 freeway, asked if we saw the bombed out buildings in the middle of the night, and talked about having to save Obama. At that time, even though my husband and I had never known our son to use any illicit drugs, all I could associate his labile emotions coupled with these vivid hallucinations was with some kind of hallucinatory drug. Shane's own words are what prompted my now almost 6 years of investigating what tweaked his mind that October 2000 night. "Mom, I know you don't think I've used drugs, but I just smoke pot. but don't worry, it's harmless, just an herb. Instinctively, I knew for my son's brain with 23 years of with always healthy, normal behavior, his rapid descent into this out-of-body experience, this drug was anything but harmless to my son's brain. My critique of the research since concludes, for a subset of pot users, especially over time, these high-octane strains of THC cause insidious changes to some of their brain chemistry. The politics of marijuana are far ahead of the evolving science, I feel, surrounding today's turbocharged marijuana strains of THC, because growers have crossbred to increase the psychoactive properties of THC while almost breeding out the plant's own natural antipsychotic properties of CBDs, cannabidiols. When Miley Cyrus recently hosted the MTV Video Music Awards to almost 10 million, mostly young people, she clearly romanticized weed at every turn, including lighting up a joint and passing it around backstage. Social media sites, which is where this generation gets its news, pop up daily with more innocuous points of view regarding marijuana. Headline: marijuana use may not have much secondary effects, as recent studies keep proving, or marijuana is much safer than alcohol. Is it any wonder college students are smoking marijuana at a higher rate than at any time in the last 35 years as this pro-pot fever sweeps across our nation? Young people today think marijuana is harmless, natural, organic, and of course medicinal. Some mental health therapists tell me cannabis is now a power struggle in families, as young people are committed to using marijuana as a lifestyle, a form of religious freedom, a pathway to independence. One therapist mentioned cases where a son or daughter has become psychotic from using strong strains of marijuana, which doesn't surprise him because he had a similar episode years ago. This issue has become so volatile. Pot advocates want to dismiss psychosis, insist the story was made up, say the drug was laced, or just say reefer madness. But people who use marijuana and have never had a bad experience need to accept marijuana-induced psychosis is real. It is not propaganda. Folks must stop bullying anyone who bravely admits marijuana trips my brain, and for those people, I strongly believe it needs to be avoided like the plague. A quote by the pediatrician Leslie Walker haunts me. It takes years to raise a teen to his or her potential, but it takes much less time to destroy it. A medical journalist friend that I've met is convinced that today's pot carries a high risk of drug-induced psychosis, a quick mental illness diagnosis, and entry into the mental health industry, which is exactly what happened to our son once my husband and I persuaded him to enter our psych hospital, believing he would receive the best medical care. Shane was hospitalized for 10 days, testing positive to and admitting to just one substance, THC. Each night, dozens of Shane's friends visited him inside this locked unit, but it was like watching a rerun of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. The neuroleptics, mood stabilizers, and anti-anxiety meds left my son drooling, lisping, with muscle rigidity and a shuffled gait, just adding more misery and did nothing to abate his psychosis. Shane was really the glue that held his band of brothers together. But even Shane's toughest friend broke down the first night because we all together watched and witnessed my son's mind in a different dimension. The hospital psychiatrist denied the scientific studies that I immediately began researching the night of my son's terrifying mental health spiral. The diagnoses given, psychosis, NOS, not otherwise specified, rule out bipolar 1. Despite this young man with 23 years of proven, solid mental health, no mental health instability, and our family has no history of any severe mental illness, such as schizophrenia or manic depression / bipolar. Shane emerged back to normal, though it took weeks before we fully believed our son had finally recovered. With the help of a caring psychologist, Shane weaned himself off the toxic meds because of detrimental side effects, including a 55-pound weight gain over 5 months, which left stretch marks, a permanent reminder of being mentally ill for life, as the outpatient psychiatrist repeated that mantra. When I asked the outpatient psychiatrist, shouldn't my son attend drug rehab? This man smugly replied, Shane's not some drug addict, he's just used marijuana. Shane did find another job as an electrician, and he stayed in his young marriage. To our horror, 1.5 years from the first episode of psychosis, our son suffered a second break, May 2011. The safeguards I believed I had in place to alert us if our son should ever return to THC completely failed. I took Shane to urgent care the morning of his abrupt change in reality. As he was laying on our floor, holding his chest, stating, I think I'm having a heart attack, with a racing pulse of over 130. The older MD at urgent care missed the signs of acute toxicity. Despite telling this physician he was using pot, she denied pot could cause any cardiovascular symptoms. It would take several hours later until his heart rate and acute symptoms began to wane. Now, I was more equipped with knowledge and awareness about the harms from marijuana. So Shane did agree to enter drug rehab. But as if we were watching yet another horror film, Shane never received any drug rehab. He was just massively drugged until he barely recognized his own parents that came to visit each night. And the staff asked us several times, could Shane have dropped acid? He acts like he's on psychedelics. Again, my son tested positive to just one substance, THC. He was warehoused for 13 days, exiting so far worse than how he entered. And at this time, my son's life basically crumbled. His wife left him, some friends retreated, and he lost his job. The same psychiatrist who treated him in the hospital followed him outpatient, and at the first follow-up session a week later, ordered Shane off all neuroleptics, as Shane looked so good to him. This time, without any neuroleptics, almost at the same time as the first episode of psychosis started, he emerged weeks later, again back to normal. Shane confided in his therapist that he believed this time, for his brain, marijuana had altered it, but he didn't know anyone else who had ever experienced this trauma. To me, the scientific literature is quite clear. First episode of psychosis, the outcomes are often good if the person never touches THC again, but often poor outcomes if THC use is resumed. With the blessings of 2 psychologists helping Shane and our family, he was given the green light to move to our family cabin near Yosemite to start anew. Shane took his beloved dog for companionship, attended AA meetings, never touched another substance. His father drove the 9-hour round-trip commute almost every weekend to offer support. We were together over New Year's 2012 and felt Shane had turned the corner. No indication he was having suicidal thoughts, but he never shared them. But on January 13th, 12 days later when we left him, I felt my son die. My husband and I raced to our cabin after not being able to reach him. No parent should suffer finding their precious boy's lifeless body. He had taken himself off Facebook, erased all evidence of contacts on his cell phone, and left his doggie with food, water, and a sleeping bag. Shane left a note for his dad, who he knew was coming up later that evening. Dad, in big bold letters, warning him of what he would find inside those doors. Part of Shane's goodbye note included his love for his family, but 2 lines still gnaw at me. There is nothing anyone could do to have saved me. My choices led me to this point. I can't go on anymore. I very much wonder if my son's suicide 7 months post-absence from marijuana is attributed to a condition most in this country are not even aware of: cannabis withdrawal suicide. When Shane died, I searched everywhere for answers. On Dr. Drew Pinsky's website at that time, his dialogue with guests was entitled, "Addiction, Do You Need Help?" Dr. Drew posted, quote, "You need careful supervision when you stop this drug. There is an extraordinarily high incidence of suicide in the first 6 months of marijuana abstinence." This artwork comes from the Aborigines in Australia. where they have a very high cannabis use disorder. Cannabis opens doors in my head that I believe are closed for my own protection. If I go through the doors, the voices tell me to commit suicide. The Australians are far ahead of the Americans in their awareness of the association between marijuana and adverse mental health. The quote from Professor Clough from James Cook University in Australia says it all to me. After 15 years of a cannabis epidemic, we're really starting to see the chronic mental effects. We've seen acute psychosis that is irreversible, as well as depression and dependence. Unfortunately, we also have the situation where suicide is linked not just with cannabis use, but also with withdrawal. This Friday, September 25th, Shane's regal, independent, vivacious Grammy celebrates her 90th birthday, and my father just celebrated his 89th birthday. Yet for these milestones, their oldest grandson is no longer with us. Since my son's shocking and profoundly tragic death, my nephew, then age 17, experienced a very disturbing change in him from using pot with his varsity sports friends, though all the medical professionals denied pot could be a factor. Fortunately, my nephew and his family knew the events of his cousin's demise, and it took several months for my nephew to rid himself of these bizarre symptoms, like profuse sweating, even though he had stopped using pot. And my brother recently admitted, years ago in the 80s, he could not smoke pot as it triggered paranoia thoughts. Thankfully, my nephew is completely back to normal, his high-functioning, thriving self, in college and doing great. Guess what? When he tries to share our family's negative adverse effects from today's turbo pot with his peers, they don't believe him. Recently, I received a letter from a parent in California whose highly accomplished son, at age 20 last year, experienced a very adverse reaction to THC edibles. He obtained a medical marijuana card near his college very easily. One night, while watching 60 Minutes with his mom, Mel, a pseudonym, said he could predict all the news stories and felt responsible for the world. He became extremely paranoid, and after returning to college, his friend contacted the mom and played a voicemail for her. Mel had stated he might not want to live and that he was seeing flying mustaches. The parents were completely baffled by their son's sudden, overnight mental health descent into chaos. Like my son, their son Mel threw his cell phone in a creek, claiming it had to be detonated. In ER, he became agitated, paranoid, delusional, and was ultimately assessed to be in first episode psychosis with the possibility of schizophrenia. The parents researched substance-induced psychosis, but the psychiatrist nixed the link, stating, quote, "I used to work and hate Ashberries in the 60s, and I never saw such a condition." Yet Mel's blood THC levels were greater than 50 nanograms. That is 10 times the legal amount for driving under the influence. Like my son, their son was let go from an internship 2 weeks after he began for inability to focus, even though it was 3 months after his psychotic break. And like my son, their son has returned to using marijuana. He remains on leave from college, is now facing legal issues unrelated to marijuana charges. So how much responsibility does THC play in Mel's story? It's yet another young man with endless potential who had no signs of depression, no signs of mental instability, until he was derailed by the effects of THC upon his young brain. Dr. Robin Murray estimates that 200 million people worldwide use cannabis. So the number of people who suffer cannabis-induced psychosis, he estimates to be in the millions. In a Wall Street commentary in 2013, it states the scientific data receives little attention and our youth are not being told the risks. Why is it other countries have public health warnings about the harms from marijuana? Rona Ambrose, Health Minister of Canada, posted a public campaign both on TV and the internet about the increased risk of loss of IQ points and risk of suffering hallucinations and delusions, which is psychosis. I'd like to ask, why haven't our public health agencies like Health and Human Services, NIH, issued any public service announcements about the dangers from marijuana use? Since there's no single blood test that can predict who is at risk, using marijuana, in my opinion, is absolutely a game of Russian roulette. On Shane's wedding day, he gives a thumbs up sign of hopefulness. That's his personality. He could have no idea that by engaging in marijuana, he was playing the game of chance with his young brain. We still have no national tracking system to report adverse effects from either recreational or medical marijuana. If I had one wish, it would be to include a Surgeon General warning on every THC product. Regular use of this product can result in severe mental illness. Thank you for listening. Next, we're going to hear from Sally about Andy's story.